On Saturday, April 12th, the ballroom at the DeSoto in Savannah glowed like money had weight and could hang from a ceiling. Crystal chandeliers, white roses imported from somewhere colder than Georgia. 250 guests in black tie moving from champagne to bourbon as a string quartet tried to make the whole thing feel timeless. My sister Cassandra stood in the center of it all, lace, train fanned out behind her, my mother adjusting the veil like it was a crown. $300,000. That was the number my father had repeated for months. Not as a complaint, as proof. Proof that the Blake family did things properly. Proof that when we invested big. I was standing near the edge of the dance floor when my father took the microphone. Richard Blake, 62. Owner of a regional commercial roofing company. A man who measured life in contracts signed and properties owned. He cleared his throat and the room quieted, because when my father spoke, people listened. He talked about legacy, about hard work, about building something that lasts. Then he turned toward Cassandra. She's always known how to aim high, he said, smiling at her new husband. Not every daughter builds a future the same way. A small pause, just long enough. Then he looked at me. And sometimes, he continued almost lightly, it's wiser to lower your expectations. Not everyone is meant to own a home. Some people are better off being realistic. There was laughter. Not cruel laughter. The polite kind. The kind that assumes a father is joking. But he wasn't. I felt it land in my chest like something heavy and permanent. Cassandra squeezed her groom's hand. My mother, Linda, dabbed at the corner of her eye, pretending she hadn't heard the shift in tone. A few cousins glanced at me, then quickly away. I was 29 years old. I worked as a supply chain analyst for a mid-sized logistics firm on the south side of Savannah. I paid my own rent. I paid my own car insurance. The only thing my father still had his name on was the auto loan he'd co-signed 3 years earlier, when my credit file was too thin to qualify a loan. That detail mattered to him. He liked reminding me of it. The microphone caught the faint hum of the speakers as he raised his glass again. To Cassandra, he said. To daughters who know how to build something real. The applause was loud enough to swallow whatever expression crossed my face. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't leave. I stood there in a navy dress I'd bought on sale and watched my sister begin her first dance under lights my father had paid for. And I understood something I had been slow to name my entire life. In this family, investment was love, and I was not the investment. Later that night, after the cake was cut and the band grew louder, I stepped outside onto the hotel's brick patio. The air smelled like river water and gardenias. My boyfriend Marcus Hale found me there. He asked if I was okay. I told him yes. I was not okay. I was clear. My father believed I would never own a home. 3 years later, he would stand on my front porch in Boise, Idaho, looking at the proof that he had been wrong. But that night in Savannah, I said nothing. I just listened to the music through the doors and let the verdict settle. Because I had already decided I would never ask him for anything again. On Sunday afternoon, April 13th, the brunch crowd at my parents' house moved through the kitchen the way it always had, politely, predictably, orbiting Cassandra. My mother had laid out silver chafing dishes on the granite island. Quiche-carved ham fruit arranged in neat, concentric circles. The wedding glow hadn't worn off yet. Cassandra and her new husband were still being toasted with mimosas in crystal flutes that only came out for holidays and milestone announcements. I stood at the counter, refilling iced tea, listening. You two will be in your own place. Before the year's out, my father was saying to Cassandra and her husband, equity at your age sets the tone for everything else. Equity, tone, everything else. In our house, those words had always been arranged in that order. My parents' home in Savannah sat on a quiet street lined with live oaks, Spanish moss, draped low enough to brush the tops of SUVs. 4 bedrooms, brick facade, mortgage paid off early. My father liked to mention that part when company came over. We sacrificed, he would say. We built. There was a framed wall in the hallway leading to the den. Cassandra's college acceptance letter from the University of Georgia, her first marketing award, a newspaper clipping from when she chaired a charity fundraiser, all arranged in matching walnut frames. My high school diploma was in a drawer somewhere. I'd never asked which one. It hadn't started at the wedding. It had started in middle school when Cassandra's grades were celebrated at the dinner table, and mine were assessed. When she talked about internships, and I talked about books. When my father explained compound interest to her at 16, and told me at 16 that creative careers were unstable. By the time I graduated from Georgia Southern with a degree in business analytics, the pattern was fully formed. Cassandra was the return on investment. I was the cost center that hadn't yet justified itself. I don't think my parents would have used those words, but my father ran his roofing company the same way he ran our family metrics, first feelings, later. After brunch, I walked down the hallway and paused in front of that wall of frames. The glass caught the afternoon light. My reflection hovered faintly over Cassandra's accomplishments. Investment is love. That idea had been reinforced so many times, it no longer needed to be spoken. It was baked into who got help with a down payment, who got introductions to clients, who got the extra phone call. 3 years ago, when I needed a reliable car to commute across Savannah, my father had agreed to co-sign the loan, $18,000 for a used sedan. He'd handed me the pen at the bank and said, "This is responsibility. Don't make me regret it." He kept a copy of that loan agreement in the top drawer of his desk at home. I'd seen it once when he asked me to grab a stamp. The document was neatly clipped, highlighted in places that made clear where his name appeared. It wasn't just a financial arrangement. It was leverage. I stepped back into the kitchen. Cassandra was laughing at something her husband said. My mother adjusted a centerpiece that didn't need adjusting. My father caught my eye. "You heard what I said last night," he said evenly, not unkindly. "It wasn't meant to hurt you. It was meant to ground you. There's no shame in renting Avery. There's shame in overreaching." Overreaching. I nodded because that's what I had always done. I nodded and I said I understood. What I understood was this. In my father's accounting, my life was still a liability, and liabilities were managed, not encouraged. That afternoon, as I drove back to my apartment in Midtown Savannah, Spanish Moss, swaying over Victory Drive, I thought about the way he had said realistic. Not angry, not loud, certain. I didn't feel anger yet. Not fully. What I felt was clarity, taking shape, slow and steady. If I stayed inside that system, I would always be the daughter who needed grounding. I wasn't ready to confront it, but I had begun to see it. And once you see a pattern clearly, it's harder to pretend it isn't there. On Tuesday, April 15th, I stopped by my parents' house after work. Under the pretense of picking up a casserole dish, my mother insisted I'd forgotten. The house was quiet. Cassandra had already left for a short honeymoon in Charleston. My father's truck was in the driveway, which meant he was home early. His office sat just off the den, a narrow room with a heavy oak desk and framed roofing contracts lining the walls. The door was open. He was seated behind the desk, glasses low on his nose, reviewing something on his laptop. "You find what you're looking for?" he asked without glancing up. "Just the dish," I said. I hesitated at the doorway. There was a part of me that wanted to ask him directly what he meant at the wedding. Not to argue, just to understand how certain he really was. Instead, my eyes drifted to the top drawer of his desk. It was slightly open. I don't know why I noticed. Maybe because I'd seen it open before. Maybe because I already knew what was inside. 3 years ago, when we'd sat at a bank branch on Abercorn Street, signing paperwork for my car loan, my father had leaned back in the chair and said, "I'm putting my name on this. That means something. It had meant something. I stepped into the office. Dad, I began carefully. I've been thinking about applying for a position in Boise. It's a senior analyst role. Higher pay. He closed the laptop slowly. Boise, he repeated as if testing the word. Idaho. Yes. And how do you plan on managing that car note from across the country? The question landed exactly where he intended. I'd keep paying it, I said, like I always have. He leaned back in his chair. That's not the point, Avery. My name is still attached to it. You miss a payment, it's my credit on the line. I had never missed a payment. He reached forward and pulled the drawer open the rest of the way. There it was. The loan agreement, neatly clipped, yellow highlighter marking the line where Richard Blake appeared as cosigner. He tapped the paper once with his finger. This is responsibility, he said again, echoing the bank branch from 3 years ago. You want to move halfway across the country, chasing something uncertain, that's your choice. But don't expect me to support instability. Support instability. The phrase sounded reasonable, practical, even protective. But standing there, watching him rest his hand over that document like it was collateral, I felt something shift inside me. The loan wasn't just about transportation anymore. It was proof that I was still, in his view, a risk. I've never been late, I said quietly. I know, he replied. Let's keep it that way. He closed the drawer with a firm push. That was the first moment I understood the shape of the leash. Not emotional, not dramatic. Paper, ink, interest rate. A signature tying my future to his approval. I left the house with the casserole dish balanced against my hip, Spanish moss, hanging low over the driveway. In my car, I sat for a minute before starting the engine. Marcus called just as I turned the key. He'd been my boyfriend for 2 years. A software engineer with a steady temperament and a habit of listening fully before offering advice. How'd it go? He asked. He reminded me about the loan, I said. A pause on the other end. Have you looked into refinancing? Marcus asked. I hadn't. Not seriously. I don't know if I'd qualify a loan, I admitted. Maybe, he said. Maybe not. But at least then, it's data. Not leverage. Data. Not leverage. I glanced back at the house in my rearview mirror. For the first time, I saw the agreement not as help, but as a hinge. And if I wanted to walk through a different door, I would have to unhook it. I didn't tell my father that. Not yet. On Monday, April 21st, at 8:43 in the morning, I stepped into a branch of Coastal Federal Credit Union on Abercorn Street, with a folder tucked under my arm, and my pulse beating a little too fast for a routine financial inquiry. It was not dramatic. No one knew I was there except Marcus, who had texted me at 7 that morning, "You don't have to decide anything today. Just gather information. Information. Data. Not leverage." I sat across from a loan officer named Ms. Patterson, a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a silver chain and a calm voice that suggested she had walked people through harder decisions than mine. I'd like to explore refinancing an auto loan, I said. She asked for numbers. Balance remaining, interest rate, payment history. $18,000 originally. Now just under 11. Never late. Not once. And you're currently co-signed, she asked. Yes. With your father, I nodded. She typed quietly. The clicking of keys felt louder than it should have. Outside the window, traffic moved steadily down Abercorn, ordinary and indifferent. Your credit score is solid, she said finally. 708. Not perfect, but strong enough to qualify independently. The interest rate will likely be higher than what you have now. How much higher? She quoted a number that made my stomach tighten. Almost 2 points above my current rate. It would remove the cosigner entirely, she added. Title and obligation would transfer solely to you. Title and obligation solely to you. I imagined my father's desk drawer closing, the highlighted line with his name, the tap of his finger on the paper. What would I need to do? I asked. She slid a sheet across the desk. Income verification, proof of residence, insurance confirmation, a standard checklist. There was no drama in it, no moral weight, just process. When I walked back into the parking lot, the Georgia air, already heavy with late April humidity, I felt something unfamiliar. Not triumph, responsibility. That evening, I told Marcus everything over takeout containers on my small kitchen table in Midtown Savannah. The rate's higher, I said. It'll cost me more in the long run. But it buys you control, he replied. He didn't say freedom. He didn't have to. We ran the numbers, spreadsheets, what it would mean for my monthly budget. Less dining out, no summer trip, delayed furniture purchases, a narrower margin for error. I could make it work. The next morning, I emailed the hiring manager in Boise to confirm my availability for a second-round interview. By Thursday, my father called. I heard from your mother. You've been making inquiries about your loan, he said. His tone was neutral, almost conversational. I'm just exploring options, I replied. You don't need to do that, he said. As long as you're in Savannah, everything's manageable. As long as you're in Savannah. There it was, the geography of approval. If you move and something happens, he continued, I don't want surprises. I've worked too hard to protect my credit. So had I. I understand, I said carefully. That's why I'm making sure everything's handled properly. There was a pause on the line. You don't have to prove anything, he said at last. But that wasn't what this was about. After we hung up, I opened the email from the credit union again. The checklist sat there in plain black text. Income verification. Proof of insurance. Signature. 30 days, I told myself. 30 days to unhook the only line still tying my financial stability to my father's approval. I wasn't fighting him. I was rearranging the math. And math, unlike emotion, could be recalculated. On Thursday, May 15th, just over a month after the wedding, I signed the refinance documents. The credit union office smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and printer toner. Miss Patterson walked me through each page with steady patience. By signing here, she said, tapping the bottom line, you assume full responsibility for the remaining balance. Your father's name will be removed from the title once processing is complete. Full responsibility. I thought about the oak desk, the drawer, the yellow highlighter over Richard Blake's name. I signed anyway. The interest rate was higher. The monthly payment would increase by $87. It didn't sound like much on paper, but I knew exactly what $87 meant in my current budget. It meant fewer margins. It meant no cushion if something went wrong. It meant I was stepping away from protection. When I walked out into the parking lot, the Georgia sun was sharp and unforgiving. My phone buzzed before I reached my car. An email. Subject line, Boise Senior Analyst, position, offer letter. I stood there reading it twice to make sure I hadn't misinterpreted anything. Higher base salary. Relocation stipend. Start date in 6 weeks. For a moment, everything felt possible. Then the math began running in my head. Higher rent. New utilities. Health insurance transition. Moving expenses beyond the stipend. The increased car payment. And no safety net with my father's name attached. That night, I drove to my parents' house. Not to argue. Not to ask permission. To inform. My father was at the dining room table, reviewing invoices. My mother was folding linen napkins at the far end, preparing for some upcoming charity luncheon. I refinanced the car, I said. The words landed clean. My father didn't look up immediately. When he did, there was no anger in his face, only calculation. At a higher rate, he said. Yes, so now you're paying more to prove a point, I shook my head. I'm paying more to remove your risk. My mother stopped folding for a second. And the job, my father asked. I accepted it. Silence stretched across the room. Boise, he said again. But this time, it sounded less like a place and more like a verdict. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he continued. You had stability here. Family here. Support, support. I looked around the dining room, the polished table, the framed achievements down the hall, the house that had always felt conditional. I need to know what I can do on my own, I said. There it was. Not rebellion, not anger, truth. My father leaned back in his chair. You're choosing distance, he said quietly. I'm choosing responsibility, I replied. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, he nodded once. Well, he said, returning his eyes to the invoices. Don't expect us to fix it if it falls apart. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary. And in a strange way, that made mine clearer. 2 weeks later, I packed my apartment in Midtown Savannah into cardboard boxes labeled in thick black marker. Kitchen, books, office. Marcus stood beside me as I sealed the last one. You sure? He asked. I thought about the higher interest rate, the new city, the absence of a fallback plan. I thought about my father's voice at the wedding. Lower your expectations. No, I said honestly. I'm not sure. Then I picked up the box anyway, because uncertainty, chosen, felt different than limitation assigned. As I closed the trunk of my car, now fully in my name, I understood the real cost of leaving. It wasn't the $87. It was the decision to live without the comfort of being underestimated. And once you make that decision, you can't return to the version of yourself that waited for approval. On Monday, August 4th, my first day at the Boise office began before sunrise. The air was dry in a way Georgia never was. The sky felt wider. My new employer, Intermountain Freight Systems, occupied a low-glass building off Eagle Road, the kind of place where efficiency was measured in dashboards and weekly reports. I was no longer the mid-level analyst hoping for consideration. I was the senior hire brought in to help modernize their regional supply tracking model. Titles don't change who you are overnight, but they do change what is expected of you. My direct supervisor, Daniel Crowley, was 56, steady-eyed, with the patience of someone who had watched the logistics industry survive recessions and fuel crises. On my second week, he called me into his office. I reviewed your Savannah projects, he said, sliding a folder across his desk. You're thorough, but thorough doesn't always move the needle. I braced for criticism. Instead, he leaned forward. We have a distribution bottleneck in our western corridor. I want you to lead the audit. Lead. Not assist, not observe. Lead. It meant visibility. It also meant that if it failed, my name would be attached to it. For the next 3 months, I lived inside spreadsheets and warehouse visits. I flew to Spokane, drove to Twin Falls, stood in loading docks at 6 a.m, counting delayed shipments, while managers twice my age explained why things couldn't change. I listened. Then I ran the numbers. The inefficiency wasn't in labor. It was in routing software no one wanted to challenge, because the vendor was tied to a long-standing contract negotiated years earlier. When I presented my findings to the executive team in November, I didn't argue emotionally. I showed cost projections. Red lines and green lines. The delta over 5 years. Daniel watched from the end of the table. Afterward, he closed the conference room door. You're not here to make friends, he said. You're here to make systems better. That requires confidence. Confidence. It was a word my father rarely used about me. By the end of that fiscal quarter, the company approved a phased software transition. It saved them more in 6 months than my annual salary. In January, I was promoted to regional operations manager. The raise was significant, not extravagant, but solid. That same month, I met with a mortgage advisor at a local Boise bank, not to apply yet, just to understand timelines. Credit score 734. Debt-to-income ratio improving. Down payment savings growing slowly, but deliberately. You're on track, the advisor said. Give it another year of steady income and you'll be in a strong position. On a Sunday evening in February, my father called. How's Idaho? He asked. Busy, I replied. I heard you changed job titles. My mother had a way of gathering updates through extended family even across states. It's going well, I said. There was a pause. Just remember, he added, success early can make people overconfident. It wasn't aimed anger. It was caution, or perhaps reluctance. I'm not rushing anything, I said evenly. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table in my small Boise apartment, the refinance documents filed neatly in a drawer under my name alone. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to my father's expectations. I was building independent of them. There's a difference between leaving to prove someone wrong and leaving to test yourself. By the end of that winter, I knew which one I had chosen, and for the first time in my life, the numbers were beginning to align in my favor. Not because anyone invested in me, but because I had decided to invest in myself. On Friday, September 12th, 2 years and 5 months after I left Savannah, I sat across from a mortgage officer at Treasure Valley Community Bank with a manila folder resting on my knees. Inside it were pay stubs, tax returns, bank statements, and a printed screenshot of my credit score, 741. I had waited for this meeting, not impulsively, not emotionally, methodically. The loan officer, a woman in her early 60s named Carol Jensen, flipped through my documents with the practiced ease of someone who had seen thousands of hopeful faces sit where I was sitting. You've done your homework, she said. Stable income, promotion history, no late payments, debt-to-income ratio well within acceptable range. I nodded, keeping my hands still in my lap. We can issue a pre-approval letter, she continued, based on current rates. It's not a guarantee until underwriting clears, but you're in strong position. Strong position. I thought about my father's voice in the Savannah ballroom. Not everyone is meant to own a home. I didn't tell Carol that part. When I stepped outside the bank with the pre-approval letter in my bag, the Idaho air carried the early hint of fall. I called Marcus before I even reached my car. They approved it, I said. He let out a long breath. Of course they did. We started looking that weekend. Nothing extravagant. No vaulted ceilings. No oversized kitchens. Just a 3-bedroom, 2-bath starter home in a quiet Boise neighborhood near Maple Grove. It had a small fenced yard, a slightly uneven driveway, neutral carpeting that would need replacing in a few years. It was not impressive. It was mine. By early October, my offer was accepted. That was when the phone calls from Georgia started to change. Cassandra had closed on her own house in Savannah the year before the wedding, a newer build in a gated development, financed with a substantial gift from my parents that covered most of the down payment. Now the housing market had shifted. Property values in her subdivision were slipping. Her husband's company had restructured. Bonuses were delayed. You're lucky you left when you did, my mother said one evening, her tone sharper than usual. Lucky. The word carried an edge. A week later, my father called. I hear you're house shopping, he said. I am, I replied. At these rates, I've locked in pre-approval. There was a pause, long enough for me to picture him sitting at the same oak desk, though I hadn't seen it in 2 years. Just be careful, he said. Markets turn. People overextend. I understood the subtext. Overreaching. The appraisal came back slightly, under the agreed purchase price. $4,000 short. Not catastrophic, but enough to force a decision. Either I covered the gap, out of pocket draining nearly all of my remaining savings, or I renegotiated and risked losing the house entirely. For 2 nights, I barely slept. If I walked away, it would be practical, conservative, sensible. If I pushed forward, it would leave me exposed. Marcus sat across from me at my kitchen table in Boise, the refinance paperwork from years ago still tucked neatly in the same drawer. What's the real risk, he asked. The margin, I said. There won't be much left, he nodded. But you won't be doing this to prove anything. That mattered. I called my real estate agent the next morning and chose to move forward. I wired the additional funds. Closing was scheduled for October 23rd. For the first time since that wedding speech, The outcome wasn't theoretical. It was tangible. And I knew something else too. If this failed, if underwriting found an issue, if the market shifted again, if anything cracked, I would have no one to blame and no one to rescue me. The house wasn't just an address. It was a line drawn in quiet ink. And somewhere in Savannah, I suspected my father understood that the math was no longer in his favor. But the keys were not in my hand yet. Not yet. On Wednesday, October 15th, 8 days before closing, my phone rang at 10:17 a.m. while I was reviewing a quarterly routing forecast. The caller ID read, Treasure Valley Community Bank. I stepped into the hallway outside Daniel Crowley's office before answering. This is Lena Blake. Hi, Lena. This is Carol from Underwriting. Underwriting. The word tightened something in my chest. We're finalizing your file, she said, her tone professional but measured. There's one item we need clarification on. I leaned against the cool wall, staring at the framed safety awards along the corridor. What item? There was a recent credit inquiry from a Georgia-based financial institution 3 weeks ago. It appears connected to your previous auto loan. 3 weeks ago, I hadn't applied for anything. I refinanced that vehicle over 2 years ago, I said carefully. My father's name was removed from the title. Yes, she replied. We see that, but there was an inquiry initiated from Savannah. It doesn't appear to have resulted in new debt, but we'll need a written explanation and confirmation from the original lender that no new obligation exists. My stomach dropped. Someone had attempted to access or leverage my old file. It didn't take much imagination to know who still had the original account information. I can provide documentation, I said evenly. Please do so within 48 hours. If not, we'll have to pause final approval. Pause. Not denial, but not security either. When I hung up, I didn't feel panic. I felt clarity. I walked back into my office, closed the door, and opened the drawer where I kept every refinance document from May 15th, 2 years earlier. Copies, email confirmations, release of liability forms. I scanned them all before lunch. Then I called the original Georgia Credit Union. After 3 transfers and 22 minutes on hold, a supervisor confirmed that someone had inquired about reinstating the cosigner status on my former loan. They were informed that the account is solely under your name, he said. No changes were made. Who made the inquiry, I asked. For privacy reasons, I can't disclose that. I didn't press further. I didn't need to. That evening, I called my father. He answered on the 3rd ring. I received notice from my bank today, I said calmly. There was an attempt to review my former auto loan file. Silence. Then I was just checking to make sure you weren't overextended. Checking. Without telling me. You're aware that an unnecessary credit inquiry can affect underwriting during a home purchase, I asked. Another pause. I didn't realize it would interfere. It wasn't an apology. It was a retreat. I need this to stop, I said. If you have concerns, you can ask me directly. He exhaled. You've always been sensitive about money. I almost laughed. Sensitive. At the wedding, he had declared I would never own property. Now he was surprised I guarded the path toward it. I'm not sensitive, I replied. I'm deliberate. We ended the call without resolution. But something had shifted. The next morning, I delivered a written explanation to underwriting, attaching documentation, proving the refinance, the release of cosigner liability, and confirmation from the Georgia Credit Union that no new debt existed. By Friday afternoon, Carol called again. We're satisfied, she said. Final approval is moving forward. Satisfied. The system had evaluated the interference and kept going. For the first time, I saw the pattern clearly. My father didn't want me to fail publicly. He wanted plausible deniability. Concern, caution, advice, all dressed as protection. But interference is still interference. Closing remained scheduled for October 23rd. The house was still within reach, and now I understood something critical. The battle was no longer about whether I could afford a home. It was about whether I could secure it without permission. The numbers were solid. The documentation was clean. All that remained was the final signature. And this time, no one else's name would appear beside mine. Closing was scheduled for Thursday, October 23rd at 2 p.m. I signed the final documents in a quiet conference room at Treasure Valley Community Bank. The same neutral walls, the same measured tone from Carol. Page after page slid across the polished table toward me. Borrower, owner, Lena Blake, no cosigner, no secondary name. When I placed my signature on the last line, the pen didn't shake. It was almost anticlimactic. Years of tension distilled into ink. At 3:17 p.m., Carol handed me a small envelope. "Congratulations," she said. Inside were 2 keys and a garage door opener. Metal, weighty, undeniable. I drove straight to the house. The previous owners had already moved out. The living room smelled faintly of fresh paint and vacuumed carpet. The late afternoon sun cut through the front windows, casting long rectangles across the floor. I stood in the center of the empty room, keys in my palm, and waited for some surge of triumph. It didn't come. What came instead was quiet. 3 days later, on Sunday evening, October 26th, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. Marcus was in the kitchen unpacking boxes of dishes. I walked to the door, not thinking twice, and opened it. My father stood on the porch. Richard Blake looked older than I remembered. Not dramatically, just diminished. The confidence that had once filled rooms now seemed contained within the lines of his jacket. "How did you get my address?" I asked. "Public records," he said. "Of course." The house purchase had posted online that morning. "I was in Salt Lake City for a conference," he continued. I drove up. He didn't try to step inside. He just stood there, hands clasped in front of him. "I heard about the underwriting issue," he said. "Did you?" I replied. He nodded once. I didn't intend for it to complicate things. Intent. The word again. "It did," I said. We stood in silence. The Idaho air colder now than it had been the week before. Behind me, the house felt solid. Framed. Mine. "Cassandra and Evan are selling," he said suddenly. I blinked. Their subdivision dropped another 7%. They're underwater. They can't carry the mortgage and the HOA fees. I said nothing. I co-signed a short-term bridge loan to help them cover until the sale, he continued. It's strained. There it was. Not an apology. Not quite, but consequence. The market he had warned me about had shifted in ways he hadn't predicted. The investment he'd championed at that $300,000 wedding had not appreciated into security. It had eroded into liability. "I thought you should hear it from me," he added. I studied his face. For years, he had spoken about prudence, caution, realism, about not overreaching. Now, he stood on my porch in a city he once dismissed, facing a daughter he once underestimated. "I didn't buy this house to prove you wrong," I said, evenly. "I bought it because I was ready." He swallowed. "I see that." It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no reconciliation, just acknowledgement. "You said at the wedding that not everyone is meant to own a home," I continued. "That's been echoing in my head for 3 years. His jaw tightened slightly. I was wrong. Simple, direct, and heavier than any speech. For a moment, I considered inviting him in. Instead, I stepped back just enough to let the porch light frame us both. "I'm not angry," I said, "but I don't need your supervision anymore." He nodded. "I understand." When he turned to leave, his shoulders seemed narrower than I remembered. I closed the door gently. Inside, the house was still quiet, still empty of furniture, still unfinished, but it was no longer a question. Outside in Savannah, the financial scaffolding he had built around my sister was shifting under pressure. Karma doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives with market reports, bridge loans, and a long drive to a daughter's front door. And even then, it doesn't undo the past. It simply redraws the balance. On Thursday, November 27th, Thanksgiving morning, I woke up in my own house to the sound of the furnace turning on. Boise was colder now. The lawn outside my bedroom window carried a thin silver frost. For a moment, I lay still, listening to the quiet hum of a system that functioned. Because I paid for it, maintained, it owned it. 3 years earlier, I had stood in a ballroom while my father said, "Not every daughter builds a future." Now, I stood in a kitchen that was fully mine, whisking eggs in a ceramic bowl I had bought with my own debit card. Marcus was setting the table in the dining area, unfolding simple linen napkins. No catered event, no string quartet. Just a roasted turkey in the oven and 2 folding chairs we still hadn't replaced. At 9:12 a.m., my phone buzzed. A message from my father. "Happy Thanksgiving. I hope your home is warm." I read it twice. Not performative, not corrective, just simple. I responded, "It is." An hour later, Cassandra called. Her voice sounded different than it had at that wedding years ago. Less polished, less certain. "We closed yesterday," she said. "On the sale." "How are you?" I asked. "We'll be fine," she replied, though the pause told me fine meant rebuilding. Smaller rental, tighter budget, no more gated entry. "I didn't understand what you were trying to prove back then," she continued. "Now, I think maybe you weren't trying to prove anything." "I wasn't," I said. The conversation ended without resentment, just recalibration. That afternoon, Marcus and I carried our plates to the living room and sat on the floor, backs against the couch we had finally bought 2 weeks earlier. The house still had empty corners, walls that needed art, a guest bedroom with no bed. But it felt complete. Later, as the sun dipped behind the neighboring roofs, I walked outside and stood on the front porch. The mortgage payment would draft automatically next week. The property taxes would be due in spring. Responsibility didn't disappear once you signed papers. It deepened. I thought about my father driving back to Georgia after standing on this same porch, about the bridge loan he had taken on for Cassandra, about the market shifts he hadn't predicted. Karma hadn't humiliated him. It had educated him, and in the process, it had freed me. Because justice, I realized, isn't watching someone fall. It's no longer needing them to stand taller than you. That evening, I placed the 2 original house keys in a small wooden bowl by the door. No duplicate in anyone else's pocket. No secondary name on the deed. Just mine. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. 3 years ago, I left Savannah with a refinance document and something to prove. Today, I had a mortgage, a furnace, humming in winter, and nothing left to argue. The balance had redrawn itself. If you've ever been told to lower your expectations by someone who thought they knew your limits, I'd love to hear how you handled it. Share your story in the comments. And if this one resonated with you, consider subscribing and staying for the next chapter.